Welcome to my November reading wrap-up. For the month of November, I participated in an IndigAthon and then Nonfiction November, but through reading books by Indigenous authors. The first book I read for this was Jonny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead. I listened to this on audio, which I enjoyed, so I would recommend that. This book was not what I thought it was. I don't know if I was remembering the pitch incorrectly that I've heard from other people, but it's essentially about this young adult. Jonny Appleseed is I think he is right above 18 or in his late teens, but is an adult at this point. And he moves from the reservation to the city, and you're seeing this timeline of him in the city. He needs to get back to the res, so he is trying to make money to get back there. And as he's making money, you're seeing flashbacks. So flashbacks to his life at the res growing up, flashbacks to times he's had with friends that have also moved to the city with him. You're kind of getting these back and forths, and it's not always clear the chronology of events. The flashbacks aren't necessarily happening chronologically. Some people might find that confusing, but if you kind of just let the story wash over you in the way that Jonny is trying to tell it, it kind of comes together narratively. It's about him being current in his current life, doing sex work online. It's about his Indigenous identity, his First Nations identity. It's about him growing up, finding his queer identity, his two-spirit identity, and his relationships with his best friend, which is very tumultuous, and other people kind of along the way. It was very, how do I describe the writing? It was very gritty, but also very crass and conversational. It really reminded me of Nevada by Imogen Binney, where it's just kind of this first person narrative of someone coming into an identity. And yeah, they use a lot of language, and there's a lot of bodily fluids on the page. So I don't think it's if that bothers you, then I don't think you would enjoy this book. I don't know how to describe this. It wasn't necessarily a coming of age, but it was just a kind of rumination on a person and kind of what makes a person become who they are. And that book counted for IndigAthon for the prompt where I read a host's favorite, and this is one that Bear at A2 Brody had mentioned in the past. The next book I finished was Genocidal Love by Bevann. This is a book that's an autofiction, but it was originally published with a different name as a biography or memoir, and then it was republished fictionalizing elements as Genocidal Love. So this is a residential school autofiction. I keep bouncing between these words because it did feel very memoir-ish. It felt like I was experiencing someone's actual life, and I'm not sure how much of this was fictionalized. But there's a forward at the beginning, and there's this really interesting part of it that I kind of just want to speak to because it was really good in shaping how I experienced the novel, I guess. I think that people, especially in Western culture, tend to want things to fit in a specific box. Is it fiction? Is it nonfiction? And people have, gotten into controversies because people have, labeled something as nonfiction that actually had fictionalized elements. Okay, so in the beginning, the foreword says, I was curious if there was a Cree word for the genre of fictional autobiographies. Cree Métis scholar Deanna Rader explained to me in an email that, quote, the categories of fiction and nonfiction don't really work in Cree, not because there isn't an understanding that some things are true and some things are not, but that someone telling their own story might elaborate to make the story more entertaining, and that since everyone tells the story from their own perspective, how one person relates an event might very well differ from someone else's version. So I really like that perspective. I think that just in general, memoirs have been hard for me to get into because like there'll be like whole dialogues in a memoir and I'm always like, well, how do you remember that? And in my head, I wanted it to be like absolute nonfiction, but like, nothing made up, but someone's experience is someone's own lived experience. And even how you remember something happening, it's probably not how something actually happened, but it's like your impressions and your emotions and what you experienced in those moments, and then the recollection of those moments. So I appreciated just the contextualization of that idea before going into the novel. The novel itself is mainly not about her experience at a residential school. It is about her, like there's a very short section about her life growing up beforehand. There is one section that's less than 20 pages about her experience in the residential school, and then it's mainly about how that impacted her life afterwards. The section on her being in a residential school is very traumatizing. There is sexual assault on the page. It was very hard to read. I recommend just keep that in mind if you choose to read this. A majority of the book is then her kind of discussing how the trauma impacted her children, impacted her ability to be a mother, impacted her ability to have normal relationships, aka she didn't have them. Her relationship with herself, being told that she was ugly and dirty and a pagan over and over at a very young age, and just how much that trauma kind of recreated trauma throughout her life. She kind of lived in wheels of trauma. Jonny Appleseed, this is not a linear telling. The chapters kind of have a loose idea of something she wants to talk through, and sometimes they're in you can realize you're jumping back into the past, and sometimes into the future. So I want to say if that bothers you, don't pick that up. I know that bothers some people. Some people want stories to be told in a very linear fashion, but just in my reading of different cultures' literature, that's not how a lot of non-Western, the non-Westernized, colonized part of the world looks at time. It's more cyclical and circular, which I just see pop up in literature like this, including this book. If you need to know all the timelines of how all these things in her life connect, you're not really going to get them. You're not going to get a timeline. Writing wise, it's very declarative. You don't really get deep into her head or the emotions of a lot of things as they're happening. It's very much this happened, and then this happened, and then I felt this way, and she's really pulling a huge span of time into a very small book. So you don't get very deep into anything. It's a much more zoomed out experience that she's kind of showing, and it's kind of showing, like I said before, the cyclical nature of her trauma and how it's kind of come up again in different areas of her life. There's also not just child abuse, but abuse in her later relationships. So I would just look up the trigger warnings before you pick this up. Goodreads isn't very good about that, but if you look at Storygraph, people will tag triggers. There is a part where there's transphobia on the page. She has experiences with someone who is trans and doesn't get their transness, and that's very apparent on the page. In the book, the protagonist, she grows from it, but just something to keep in mind if you choose to pick this up. Oh, Genocidal Love I read for like favorite color on the front, or like favorite color. Oh, also, if you watch my TBR, I talked about some Indigenous-owned companies that you could get stuff from, and this was one of the companies I wanted to get something from, and they had like hats drop, and so I just want to show you. I really like it. It's super warm. I live upstate New York. We're already having below freezing days, or days like right around freezing, and I wear it out, and I'm not cold at all. So if you're interested, I don't know if they have any more hats right now, but they do drops every once in a while. I'm drinking tea, but if you know what this is, then you know what this is. That's all I'm going to say. Okay, next I've read Postcolonial Love Poem by Natalie Diaz. This is a poetry collection, and I don't have too much to say about this because I didn't get it. I think that's just like, I try to get into poetry, and it just doesn't really click for me. Like, most of the time, I don't really get what poems are about. Like, they get a little too meta for me, and I'm just like, I don't really know what you're trying to say with this. I think poetry is one of those things that you kind of have to like repetitively read to try to, get more acquainted with it. But I'm not that type of reader, so I don't really know what to say about this poetry collection. There was a lot of repetitive imagery. There was this imagery of like her as a beast. There was a lot of reference to horns. There was a lot of reference to the color green. And then there were hips everywhere. Like hips in this one, hips in that one. There were hips all over the place. There were things where I feel like the imagery was later described in more detail in a later poem. And again, I think that if you kind of like consume this in like a circular fashion, like if you read the whole poetry collection and then you read it back almost immediately, I think that a lot of this would maybe click more and make more sense. I'm just personally not that type of reader, and I also just haven't found my poetry, I haven't found my poetry niche. I don't really know what it is yet, so cannot tell you to read this or not. And then I read that for a poetry collection. That was the prompt. Next, I read Last Night in Nuuk by Niviaq Korneliussen. This is translated from the Greenlandic. It's about a group of young people in Nuuk, kind of having messy lives and watching those lives intertwine. There's like cheating, and there's like leaving your long-term lover, and there's alcoholism, and there's partying, and there's like coming into your queer identity. Again, like in this book, there's homophobia on the page. Each section is written a little bit differently, and it's written from a different person in the group's perspective. And I shouldn't really call it a group because it's not like a solid group of friends. It's like kind of people who know each other and like the weaving of lives. This book didn't really leave much of an impression. Like I read it in like the course of a day. It was quick. It was fine while I was reading it, but it was pretty immemorable, I guess, for me. There's not much of a plot pushing the narrative forward. It's more of like the connections between people, and some of the sections go on for like multiple days, and some sections take place just over the course of one day. So pacing wise, it's like not very consistent. I wouldn't push people to read the book, but if it was on your radar already and there was something about it that interested you, like I would say read it. But there was nothing about it that it was particularly memorable, but it was exciting to get something in translation from the Greenlandic. I haven't found anything else translated from that language, so that's cool at least. And then I read this for the favorite color prompt as well. So then throughout my experience reading those books, I was also reading Why Indigenous Literatures Matter by Daniel Heath Justice. This is like a nonfiction, and he does kind of talk about what he's trying to convey in the introduction, but there's a lot going on in it. The thesis of it is why Indigenous literatures matter, and it's not a simple answer to convey. Like, of course they matter, but trying to like qualify or quantify that in a book takes a lot more than just talking about literature. So he kind of broke it up by like themes, by like relationships to people, relationships to animals, kinship, like oral literature, the oral tradition, and kind of just like confronts each of these ideas, but also gives cultural context. You don't have to go into this book knowing anything already, because he does a really good job of like providing a lot of context. So a lot of the book isn't actually about the literature, because he's giving like cultural context to whatever he wants to talk about, and then he explores it in like literary works. One thing that this book was great for was finding new books. He references so many other works in this, and he talks about in the introduction about how he intended to, his intent was to talk about works that aren't as well known or authors that are less well known. One thing I will say with this book is that he goes into, like, in order to convey his points, he has to give a lot of plot away from some books. So you will have books spoiled for you. I personally didn't mind that. I hadn't read any of the books that he was referencing, and he had to give background to the book to give context, but it also gave a perspective on the book that I myself don't have and would have to seek anyway. So it was nice hearing these perspectives before I go and read these books. And he was looking at like these works through a specific lens of like what he was trying to convey in that section. Also, in terms of literary works, he did this project where he, I think for 1 year, he made like a Twitter post about every single, like of an Indigenous author or an Indigenous author's work. I listened to this on audio, and then that is actually all of those Twitter entries, including like new additions and some switch outs for people that he no longer promotes, are in the book. So I actually, after I finished this, I bought a e-copy of it so that I have all of these books as reference. No, it's so hard to describe this book because there's so much in it. There's so much information. There's so many books referenced. There's just a lot, but it never felt overwhelming when I was reading it, and it never felt like too much information. I don't really see people talk about this book, and I just highly recommend it. I thought it was a really great read. This was not on my TBR. This is where I went a little rogue, and this one would have counted for the nonfiction prompt. Oh, and I forgot to mention, but he does say this at the beginning, it's very much centered on North American Indigenous peoples. So he does reference the fact that he's not really talking about Indigenous people from elsewhere in the world. So that's also a thing to keep in mind. Dead White Writer on the Floor by Drew Hayden Taylor. This is a play about Indigenous characters or people who have been like characterized by white writers and the white consciousness, am I saying the right word? And it starts with them in a room, and there's a dead white writer on the ground. And it's kind of these 6 characters and their conversation as it happens. It's a 2-act play, and so it's pretty short. I got through it pretty quickly, and I imagine if you saw it on stage, it would be a very short play. Act 1, I enjoyed. Act 2, I also enjoyed, but it was a little bit confusing. So there's like a thing that happens at the end of Act 1, and when you meet your characters again in Act 2, they all have different names, which is confusing. If you saw this in person, I'm sure it wouldn't be confusing because you would recognize the actors for each of the parts. But reading this, it was hard to follow, and I kind of had to go back and connect each character. So if you read this and you don't want to do that, here is who each character is. I enjoyed this. I think I would prefer it on stage. I haven't gone to a play in years, but I used to go to plays all the time with my family when I was growing up, and I do like going to plays, so I would enjoy experiencing this live. I think that what it has to say about white people writing Indigenous people into a place on paper, and then white civilization and colonizer and settler society also forcing similar things onto Indigenous people was well done. I liked the parallels that were explored in the acts, and I don't want to say too much more because I don't want to spoil things, but thematically I enjoyed what it was doing. I personally wish that it was longer. I think that what was done between Act 1 and 2, the shift, it could have been done another time, and I think it would have hit I feel like I'm being so vague. I feel like it would have hit the themes home a little bit harder, but I still think it's worth reading. I don't know how I will ever see this live. I don't know how many times it's been performed. Another little qualm I had with it was that there was one character in Jinzhou in the first part who was very much the protagonist, and he was kind of the main character of the second part as well, and his character got a lot more fleshed out than anyone else's, and I think that if there was another act to this, there would have been a bit more breadth and a bit more room to breathe into the narrative, and each of the other characters could have been built up a little bit more, because there are two in the second act that were they didn't really have much to say, and so the characters didn't feel as fleshed out. I read this one for the host favorite or host recommendation prompt. This is one a bear from A2 Brody's recommendations on their channel. I read Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I listened to this on audio, which I would recommend. I thought the audiobook was really great. She narrates it. I just really loved her voice. I loved the way that she kind of talked through things. I could really feel the emotions of what she was experiencing on the page. This book is exactly what the tagline says it is. She's a botanist by trade. She is Indigenous and grew up with some teachings in her life at home. She explores a lot more of those in her adulthood. She explores the teachings of the people whose land she currently resides on. And it's a lot about, it's the braiding of those concepts together, which she does so well through the book. I know everyone talks so highly about this book, but it really was a joy to read. It kind of went on for a bit longer than I thought it would. I a bit felt like it was dragging, but that's a very minor complaint in terms of the book. A lot of this, I would say 70 to 80% of this takes place in upstate New York. She works at the University of Syracuse, or a university in Syracuse. I am fairly close to Syracuse. I've spent a lot of time in the areas that she was describing, and I'm familiar with a lot of the plant life and everything that she was describing. So for me personally, it was a very joyous experience listening to someone who loves New York so much talk about New York in all of its seasons. I did not grow up here. I don't have the affinity to this environment that I do feel for the environment that I grew up in. The way she describes the feeling of like being knee deep in her pond and like digging like stuff out of it to clear it up and get all of like the pollutants and nitrogen and stuff out, or phosphates, was very joyous. Like the feeling that she had in the way she conveyed her language of like the beauty of this space would not make it, I wasn't getting the sensation of like, oh, I totally agree, I love New York too, but it like made me recollect on places that I have like that, where I can kind of just like sit and like think of a place and kind of let it wash over me and just get like joy of the memory of a location. What is the word I'm looking for? It was almost nostalgic, even though it wasn't, like I was feeling her nostalgia through my experiences, even though it wasn't my nostalgia. My partner grew up here. His family lives much closer to Syracuse than we live now, and has grown up there. Very like big outdoorsy people, live in the middle of the woods. So I've been recommending this book to his whole family, and most people I live near, because I just think anyone who lives in New York would enjoy this. I think anyone who lives anywhere would enjoy it, but I think that I had a bit more of an interest in the New York sections than the sections where she was talking about other places. There's sections on like the Pacific Northwest, and she was in Kentucky for a while. I think if I were to try to like call this book one thing, it would be like nature philosophy, but she even has like studies in it. I don't know, I could talk about this book forever, but it was such just like a beautiful blend of nature writing and scientific like studies and pondering of things, and then this indigenous wisdom that she kind of brings in, like the different stories that she shared. I just keep going back to the word joyous, but it was just such a joyous read, and I read this one for the Indigenous Joy Prompt, so go figure. Okay, next I read Tracks and Four Souls by Louise Erdrich. So I have never read any Louise Erdrich before, and I wanted to start with her Love Medicine series, so I was wanting to read it chronologically as I saw it recommended by Danny at Thunderbird Woman Reads. In Tracks, you meet a cast of characters in the early 1900s living on a reservation in, I believe, Minnesota, and you kind of follow this community of people through about a decade of time from two different perspectives. One of them is Nanapush. He is an elder, or what constitutes as an elder at this point, because a lot of the older people have died of a disease or plague that came through. Yeah, and then you get a perspective from Pauline. You see and you get to know those two characters very intimately. But this book is really about Flor Pillager. People really don't know what to do with her. It opens up with her family all dying in this virus or disease that comes through, except for her. And Nanapush kind of helps her get healthy again and becomes like a parental figure. There's a lot of relationships explored in this book. There's relationships like kinship, I guess. Relationships that are like kinship, but they're not familial by blood. Relationships between different people on the reservation and different kinship groups, and how like the people can be quite divided. You see some of that play out between people. And then you get to see characters, like you get to see them, like their people's interaction with the religious aspects of their culture, and then also the colonizing, like Catholic, or I think they're Catholic, or they're Christians. You have like a father, Damien, who lives on the reservation, and their relationship to him, their relationship to the land and the allotments that they all live on, and by proxy, the relationship to the government. There is so much explored in so few pages, and you really get a great sense of a lot of the characters. It's being told, you can tell it's being told in the future as Nanapush is speaking to someone. And Pauline was an interesting character. She made some wild decisions that were very unexpected. Her relationship with religion I found really fascinating, and her relationship to herself and her Indigenous identity and how that can exist with her religious identity, and watching that kind of play out emotionally and mentally, and then how she treated people. So when I first started this book, it felt slow because you're kind of bouncing between characters. You're not seeing all of the same places at the same times. Like they're kind of in different, it starts out with them being in different physical locations. So it took me a while to get into this book. But once I was in, I was totally hooked. So hooked that I jumped right into Four Souls because I looked at the like dust jacket or the summary, and I saw that it had Fleur in it, and I was like, all right, well, we're just gonna go on and we're gonna keep reading her story. In this one, in Four Souls, it is told from Nanapush's perspective on the reservation, and then a white woman who interacts with Fleur. There is a shift at some point where you now get a new character perspective, but it's a character you've known for quite a long time and you've never seen their perspective. I saw some reviews where people said that was jarring, but I actually appreciated it quite a bit. I appreciated it because I'm glad that we got to see this person's perspective, because we really only saw Nanapush's perspective of them. His way of viewing them is a lot different than the way they feel. And so getting that information was kind of enticing. I kind of was rooting for that character a little bit more, and I was more intrigued by their relationship to Nanapush after seeing their perspective. I don't think I enjoyed Four Souls as much as I enjoyed Tracks. I liked how Four Souls kind of harkened back to scenes of Tracks, specifically like the gambling portions. I was reading in reviews people calling Four Souls Fleur's revenge plot, which it kind of is, but it's kind of like calling the Count of Monte Cristo a revenge narrative. Like, yes, that's part of it, but no, that's not the whole book. That's not really, it's more complicated than that. People are going to fight me about that. Just like imagining people being like, the Count of Monte Cristo is a revenge plot, which I agree, but it's a lot more than that. The downfall of this book, well, I still really enjoyed it and would recommend it. And if you've read Tracks, you should read Four Souls. It gives you kind of some resolution of characters. While I liked it, I feel that Fleur being a protagonist, but never seeing Fleur's perspective, takes away a little bit from the narrative. In the first book, it paints her with a sense of mystery, but by the second book, I didn't really want her to be as mysterious anymore. I wanted her to, I don't know if I want to say I wanted to understand her better, but I felt like it was kind of like still trying to like rope you in with the same trick. And I feel like it would have been a little bit more satisfying if she gave us a little bit more. And maybe someone closer to Fleur, because there's still so much mystery about her, and maybe this opens up more in other books. I don't know if Fleur as a character is explored a bit more. For me, she bordered on the line of like hashtag like too mysterious. Like she's this dark, brooding, mysterious character. And she fell a little bit flatter for me. Four Souls was much more focused on different ways that colonizer culture impacts the reservation and people through alcohol use, through consumerist culture, through the ideas of trying to one-up people, and then the clashing or the coming together through culture, and kind of showing the perspective of some of those like white settlers who didn't really get what they were doing and the impact that they were making. I thought it bordered a little bit on too sympathetic for me for one of the white characters, but I still appreciated getting his perspective. And then I finished Song of Lawino, Song of Ocol. So this is translated from the Ocoli, and the author is from the Ocoli culture, which is in northern Uganda. This book also talks about colonization. It's a work of poetry. I found the introduction very helpful because this was translated by the author into English. And the foreword written by someone else kind of speaks to some of the differences. And while these like poems, it's like not a book in verse, I guess, but it doesn't really like feel that way. These like longer poems did rhyme in Ocoli. And the author chose not to rhyme them when he translated it into English. I thought it still worked really well. This is like plotted poetry. This like all of these poems are long and they're connected and they have like a like thematic purpose that's like propulsing it forward. And let me get into what it's about. So Song of Lawino and Song of Ocol can be read, I guess, separately. But Song of Lawino is from the perspective of Lawino, who is a woman of Ocoli culture, and her husband, Ocol, goes to a white university and learns English and learns about colonizer culture, and now has decided that culture is better and Ocoli is backward, and he's kind of internalized all of these racist ideologies that he's been presented about his upbringing. And he thinks that he's better than his wife because she is Ocoli, like through and through, culturally. And this is her kind of laments and kind of cries out to him about him and like how he's wrong, essentially, and kind of just like breaks it down, like him bringing home a new woman. Why do you expect me to do these things? Like all of these cultural things that he grew up with and he used to love. Now suddenly he's telling his wife that he detests them and he detests her for it, and she's kind of, it's all about her pushing back on those notions. I learned a lot about the culture as I was reading it because it's her kind of hearkening back to all of these like cultural things that she does and explaining like why they make sense, like the food she eats and the way she dances and the way she dresses or the way she doesn't wear clothes. And then like the opposition of like what he's telling her is right and how it's confusing to her. Like she just doesn't get it. Like, why would you want me to do this? I am who I am. This is my culture. Like, I don't want to be something else. And then that's the majority of it. And then the Song of Ocol is kind of his responses to that, but not really. I think Song of Lawino was a lot stronger in terms of what it was trying to convey and present, and his counter arguments in Song of Ocol, while not really directed at his wife, because these were two separate texts and were published separately, doesn't really like disagree with anything she's saying. He's kind of just like has this like righteous anger about him, and he's like prophesizing about like why what he's doing is good and how dare these other people try to like disagree with him. I've never heard people talk about this book. I have this is I think my third this is the third book in translation that I've read that's translated from like an Indigenous African language this year. And this, not to compare them, I guess, but this was by far my favorite. I got along with this one quite well, and I would recommend it to people who are interested in it. I just thought it was a really like interesting work. I think part of the fun of reading books like this is that like there's so many elements that are culturally so much different than what I experience and what I agree with on a personal level, but it's not really about that. In the reading experience, you know, it's not about like what's right and wrong, even though that is what this book is about, to Lawino personally. Not that she's a real person, she's a fictionalized character, but it's about, oh man, I just went down like a rabbit hole of words. It's kind of like about kind of like letting, like shaking away like your feelings of culturally what is acceptable versus unacceptable, and just kind of like being like attempting to be like a neutral force when reading these works, and just understanding that, yeah, some things in this book I would find sexist. But who am I to say culturally that that's acceptable or not acceptable if that's what works for them? I think that there's just like kind of just like a widening of perspective that can happen when you read books from other cultures. So I guess that is my TED Talk on why you should read globally or locally. Read Indigenous literatures from everywhere. Those are all the books I finished. This one I also counted as a poetry collection or a work of poetry. That is all I got. I had a lot to say this month. I had a fun reading month. Let me know how you feel about any of these books. Do you have any recommendations for me based on these? Have you read any of them? Do you want to read any of them now? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for being here, and until next time, happy reading.